That sheriff, in hearing her sing that song, was so moved that he unloaded his gun and waited until King came near him and handed King the bullets and said, "My weapons have no power. I can't fight against the kind of beauty and the struggle for justice that you represent. It's like you've touched my heart and I know I was wrong." I don't think we grapple enough with those kinds of stories about the power of art, the power of music, the power of faith to kind of transform how we relate to one another.
It's not every day that you have the honor of meeting a national treasure who's creating new art genres and movements to help us expand our imagination and stretch our understanding of what's possible. First inspired by Marvel and DC Comics in his youth, Dr. Walter D. Greason is the Distinguished DeWitt Wallace Professor in the Department of History at Macalester College. Wondering why there weren't Black people in the futures presented in classic sci-fi stories, Walter became one of the founders of Afrofuturism, a new lens to reimagine a tomorrow that's inclusive for all. He also gave the world the Wakanda Syllabus and helped bring the fictional city of Wakanda to life in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Black Panther blockbuster films. Named one of today's Black history makers by the Philadelphia Daily News, Walter is an educator, historian, media ecologist, economist, and urbanist all in one who has authored 18 books on democracy, capitalism, and digital economies in the world today. His latest book, an Amazon bestseller, The Graphic History of Hip Hop, is a graphic novel and scholastic experience charting the evolution of the genre hip hop and its myriad impacts on culture and society. With such a deep wealth of wisdom on the power of art, especially in today's infinite digital landscape, combined with its understanding of the transformations shaping our society and culture, both at a macro level and down to a personal one, it's an honor to have Walter on the show. This is a conversation I'll be revisiting often as we explore some of the most pressing topics of our time as we transition from the information age to the imagination age. Today's conversation spans a wide array of topics, from the mythological power of comics to Walter's perspective on the current state of democracy and the world as we transition to digital capitalism, opening up new avenues for economic freedom. Walter also shares what co-powering is, along with a snapshot of the current media landscape in the age of Gen AI, the convergence of mediums, and the counter-convergence backlash we're seeing globally. With expertise in Black speculative arts, the racial wealth gap, and patterns of economic globalization, Walter shares new frameworks to help us reimagine the future, as well as our relationships with time and each other. In a world that can be overwhelming, listen in as Walter provides answers and shows what's possible when we break free of current narratives and give ourselves the time, love, and permission to dream about what's possible. Enjoy.
But have you ever thought, what if this is all just a dream?
Welcome to Creativity Squared. Discover how creatives are collaborating with artificial intelligence in your inbox, on YouTube, and on your preferred podcast platform. Hi, I'm Helen Todd, your host, and I'm so excited to have you join the weekly conversations I'm having with amazing pioneers in the space. The intention of these conversations is to ignite our collective imagination at the intersection of AI and creativity to envision a world where artists thrive. Walter, welcome to Creativity Squared.
Joy to be here with you.
It's so good to have you technically back on the show because we did a special series for the Data for Public Good where you were a speaker, and it was such like a great sampling, and I know we have so much to talk about. So really excited to dive in. For those who are meeting you for the first time, can you share who you are, what you do, and a bit of your origin story with us?
I'll do my best. My name is Walter Greason. I am a professor of history. Very well, currently, I am the DeWitt Wallace Professor of History, which is an endowed chair, just a lifelong achievement award. So, um, still adjusting clearly to the fact that I've done some good work, and folks at the college value it. But that's just a small piece of my life. I do a lot of work connecting history to education theory, connecting that to macroeconomic analysis. And then on top of those two things, building out how to use digital media and analyze emergent media platforms going forward in the 21st century. So, yeah, I have lots of pots full of different kinds of elements cooking all the time. The most recent piece following or during the time that we met is the graphic history of hip hop, which has completely changed my life. That around the world, people are writing to me, calling me every day, demanding more copies of the graphic novel. It's invented a field, a very profitable field of graphic history that we can teach factual material using graphic formats in ways that weren't possible 2 years, 5 years, 10 years ago. And so this has become the hottest field in the world for scholars is can you produce art that speaks to your research? And so that's a lot of what I'm doing right now is showing people how to convert text into images and into sounds in ways that help people learn more effectively.
Yeah, well, congratulations, first and foremost, on the success of the graphic history of hip hop. What did you say in our last conversation that it was like on the Amazon bestseller for how
Yeah,
long did
at
it
the
have that spot?
debut, it was number one for over 2 months, and we just got back. We had our all-time peak on Amazon, I think a week ago. We were at New York City for New York Comic Con, and that blew us right back up to the top of the chart again. So it's just been unbelievable.
Well, congratulations. And one reason that I'm so excited to have you on the show is part of Creativity Squared is to help envision a future where artists not only coexist with AI but thrive. And it's a platform. I use artists as the vehicle, but it's really if artists are thriving, everyone's thriving in society. And so much of your life's work has been about envisioning a different future. And I'm so excited to have you on the show to dive more into these concepts as all the listeners and viewers are trying to wrap our heads around what's here and what's happening. And so much of your work centers around the intersection of democracy, capitalism, and digital markets. So to start with, can you give us a snapshot or a time capsule of sorts of the current state of these three and what you're seeing from like a bird's eye view of the patterns? It's a big topic of economic globalization, where they're currently headed and what's possible when we embrace a co-powered future. And I know we introduced co-powering with Awesome and in your previous interview, but we might need a refresher for our audience what that means too.
Absolutely. So I'll be a little succinct with the big concepts and then tie it all back together through the frame of co-powering and what we see Twin Cities Innovation Alliance doing with Asim and Marika. So democracy is in crisis. One of the biggest areas of concern for me is the consensus that emerged from World War II around an international order that protects human rights is actively under assault. And there is a large international coalition led by conservatives in North America, by autocrats in Asia and Europe and Russia that want to reinstate a world of empires and dictatorships that existed in the 19th and the early 20th century. And it's a massive danger to billions of people now and untold billions going forward. So democracy requires defense at this minute, not just within any single country, but around the world. Then when we come to capitalism, capitalism is in transition. And this is probably the most enduring piece of my research that will outlived me the longest is that we're in the midst of an information technology revolution. There has not been a similar transition in human experience since the invention of the printing press. And so I teach constantly about the need to understand what capitalism is, what it was to have agricultural capitalism versus industrial capitalism. And now what we are developing is digital capitalism. And we have people from Jeff Bezos to the founders at Google to Steve Ballmer and Elon Musk that are actively trying to shape what the next stage of digital capitalism will be. But it's got to be embraced by people at the grassroots. It's got to be understood by people who will labor in these new marketplaces. And so the debates around large language models or AI, that is deciding what kind of lives people will live for the rest of this century. And those questions are unsettled. And a lot of what comes out of the next 3 global election cycles will set the rules for what kind of lives people will live based in a digital economy. So that's a thing I work on a lot, is giving people the tools to make informed choices. So that's democracy, and then capitalism. Digital markets are the kind of subset of this question that I remember when I started teaching students about digital markets more than a decade ago, we would talk about the way their devices would listen to them. And they couldn't imagine that their phone would track their behavior, or their laptop might focus and kind of tune in and be under someone else's control to pick up what's on their camera or what's on their microphone. And I remember it was groups of students who were like, is that why they keep trying to sell me socks after I Googled socks? And so whatever topic, they just were unfamiliar with how cookies could be used and the way people would aggressively data mine and sell their information to further stimulate the marketplace. And the idea of having a digital footprint was completely foreign. And we're just at the initial stages of that becoming part of everyone's lives. But I'll be very frank, for me, from the first moment I saw what Facebook was, I was like, oh, this means all of us are now compiling a digital profile, and everything we do online will be visible to people that we'll never meet. And so all of my online behavior has been through that lens of assuming I'm always on camera. I am always visible to someone who may not have my best interests at heart. And that has helped me build a variety of different initiatives and programs and businesses, and helps people figure out how to interact in the digital marketplace in a way that empowers them. And the things that I've seen that have been the most impactful are things that I teach around passive income, that people don't have to rely on a single job or even a set of part-time jobs in order to maintain quality of life. And so during COVID, what was really apparent to me is that when people could not go into work in the same way, that they had to manage their time at home differently, all of a sudden these people were starting up small businesses and quote unquote side hustles and extra gigs that were making them much more financially free. And so there's just, I could spend the rest of my career studying the economy in 2020, 2021, 2022, because it enables people to have a higher standard of living that's not as dependent on having a single full-time employer. And so that's part of the shifts of what's happening in digital markets, is that if we just allow ourselves to be consumers, we're losing out on the ways that we can be producers and distributors and people who maximize the commercial digital market space for our own interests.
Thank you. And could you also mention co-powering and what that means and how it all plays into all of this as well, Walter?
Yeah, so the concept of empowerment had gained enormous traction over the last 30 years, of the way people who are in authority can share authority or share resources and allow people to have more say about what they can accomplish. But co-powering moves us beyond the empowerment paradigm. And it's very much what I was talking about with digital markets, is that when people have the ability to use tools and resources that they have access to on their own terms, there isn't someone with vastly more money or more education dictating the way someone can improve their lives and the range of options they have. Co-powering allows us to define the options for ourselves and to find paths that really someone in authority might not see or they might be threatened by. And that's the piece that actually lets us achieve human freedom in a deeper, more profound, and more enduring way. That, like I said, it's not just relying on a single employer or even a group of employers, that you can be anything within the society, within the economy that you hope to achieve. And that co powering principle, Asim is a genius for really kind of inventing the phrase and then teaching people how to embrace it. And that's what the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance has developed. And I take it on the road in any number of places in the US and around the world to talk about. In fact, in the last hour, I did a workshop that was like, if you're in authority, the best thing you can do is kind of share what you have to share, but then step back and don't dictate the way that people will engage with it or put it to use. Take that as an opportunity for you to learn outside of the frame of reference that you inherited when you came to be quote unquote empowered. There has to be a kind of humility in co-powering that allows everyone to participate and to shape directions that no one anticipated before they entered into the process.
Yeah, I love that it comes from more of a community-based approach to sharing power and influence versus the empowerment and the more hyper-individualistic approach that has been so embedded in at least the U.S. ethos for so long. But it seems like a lot of these ethos, like hyper-individualism, is all being challenged too. Um, One thing that I'd love for you to speak about as well is to the media landscape, the current one, and then the counter convergence that's now powered by AI, because that's all really related to these topics too.
Yeah. So for me, I took my initial training in this area as a media ecologist, which is a field invented by Marshall McLuhan out of Toronto and really popularized by Neil Postman out of New York City in the 1970s and 1980s. And they were confronting the reality that broadcast television was giving way to cable and satellite television. So we all live in a world now where there are thousands of channels and all kinds of streaming options. But what Postman and McLuhan were envisioning was a way to be critical, a way to be knowledgeable about how complicated the media environment was becoming, that fewer and fewer people would read newspapers or magazines, that the website landscape would be infinite, and there's no way to find, as a human being, all of the data that you have access to. So the process of learning how to assess your presence and your interactions in a media landscape, that's what we see through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And the example I teach students about is Harry Potter. That with the creation of those novels, they were then used by corporations to open up all kinds of new platforms for content creation. Harry Potter wasn't just the books, it was also the movie series and this generational experience of growing up watching those stories. It was also creating Hogwarts as a physical place for people to visit and to have these kinds of costumes. And we now have Quidditch teams all over the world that actually participate in this fictional sport. It's become real. And so that's what convergence media is. Media scholars began to talk about how did content in one genre transform into an entire human experience. The piece that I've done the most with in this area of convergence media is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So my entire approach to literacy was grounded in reading Marvel and DC comics as a really young person. And by the time I was in undergraduate and graduate school, I was theorizing around the mythological power of comics to shape people's sense of what they could strive for. But in the first 7 years of the 21st century, I worked with writers at Marvel Comics, Christopher Priest and Reginald Hudlin, when they reinvented the Black Panther character. And because I was studying urban design and urban planning, what I brought to them was, well, if you're going to talk about this character and his family and the people involved in his nation, It's like you need to have a really specific idea of how the country is designed. Like, where are the roads? Where are the rivers? What's the telecommunication system? You have this weird metal called vibranium. What does that mean for the ongoing technological development of the entire society? And this completely revolutionized the way people wrote about the character. I think last time I looked, over 60,000 people working for Marvel had studied the kind of encyclopedia that I put online about, okay, this is how you make Wakanda real. And that became the blueprint for what was used in the the Black Panther movie, and then Wakanda Forever, both for Wakanda itself as well as for Talakan, which is where Namor or Kulkulkan is from. They just made much more realistic places that became fantasy environments. But that was happening just at the moment when people started to want to shut down convergence as a media phenomenon. So 2016 is Brexit, it's the emergence of the Trump campaign, and billionaires were afraid, whether it was on Netflix or Amazon, any number of different emergent media platforms, that there were too many people getting too many voices a chance. And so, for me as an Afrofuturist, there were stories like Lovecraft Country or the Watchmen series on HBO that were pushing the edges of what Afrofuturism could do, but they were considered as threats to the social order. Jordan Peele and the series of films he's done, Get Out and Us, and Nope. These stories all are pressing and trying to break open the dam of who gets to control narrative in the world. And so by the time we get to 2020, there's a real sense that, and I call it counterconvergence, that only a few people should be in charge of these media landscapes. We can't allow but so many people to craft the stories that people have access to. The global protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd here in Minneapolis drove a lot of that. The worry that what we've seen Ron DeSantis and Elon Musk call woke, or they call it the woke mind virus, is explicitly about using counterconvergence to shut down the avenues for people to express themselves. And so counterconvergence in our media landscape is about narrowing the possibilities of our imaginations. And so this has deep philosophical implications in the 21st century. The people who are pushing counterconvergence want us to move towards empire, where if you're not shown something is possible, you'll never dream of an alternate possibility. And that they want to standardize in the way that industrialists used factories to kind of manufacture cars and spark plugs and every other kind of physical technology of the 20th century. They want to use counterconvergence to standardize our imaginations and what we think is possible and what kinds of languages we can speak. Um, and that's, to me, is impermissible. It's a massive violation of our human rights. But unless we stand up and fight for it as individuals, as communities, we will lose the access to this vast frontier that can really create a much freer world over the next 50, 60, 70 years.
There's so much in all of your answers and different ways to go. But one thing that came to mind as you were speaking is in terms of like controlling the narrative. And this Scott Galloway has said in some of his presentations that, you know, when we see journalists like getting laid off left and right from major media publications, as you know, one thing of some of our institutions failing, that you have like companies like Facebook and Meta that have a massive PR department that's shaping the narrative and spending a ton of money shaping the narrative. So that's one thing. I did a paper a couple of years ago with a brilliant legal friend of mine that's, as we reimagine the future, we've got Mark Zuckerberg, one person with so much power that controls and making corner office decisions for 8 billion people. Like that's so much power in single hands. So that came to mind. One thing though that I was thinking about last night ahead of this interview is almost like how do I want to say this? There's the control of the narrative through our current media and the fracturing of how we consume content. Like if we all are content, which I think we are, and that's where we're moving to, we're all content creators. And to your point, in this new economy, we'll all be producers, distributors, creators, and all of this. And at the same time, if we're so fractured, and this is an episode with Gertrude Stocker of like manufacturing our own realities and universes, where is the overarching story of commonality and common truth across these worlds? I was like thinking about this of like, there's great to have so many voices, but how do you find the commonality over them? So curious your thoughts on that.
Ooh, there are a lot of ways to answer that. I'm trying to think of the most constructive way. So, like, there's clearly my students, we had an experiment with large language models earlier this year, where for me, in preparation for a keynote, I developed 8 small language models based on different academic disciplines, where they're essentially web crawlers and chatbots that would then learn from the best of religious studies scholarship, the best of philosophical scholarship, and then would teach each other. And the ultimate webbot, my 8th iteration of it, was able to apply its own sense of humility and say, well, we're not really sure. There's a lot of ambiguity around the most difficult questions. And it was just encouraging to me to see that the bot could learn to restrain itself and not assume it can distribute truth the way that some of the more sophisticated large language models claim that this is the best way to answer a question. So I'm hopeful about that because that lets us screen information in a way that still is somewhat open-ended. At the same time, one of my students that spring did a smaller scale project for about a month where her small language model was explicitly about media literacy and how do you actually discern disinformation and misinformation in an environment where you're bombarded with content. And it's a really powerful project. But at the same time, as soon as people see it, they're able to detect kind of the falsity of the way it's been packaged. And so it reinforces an uncertainty that people like, there's nothing I can rely on. I'm disillusioned. I'm skeptical. I don't know what to actually use as a solid foundation in moving forward. And that's an extraordinarily dangerous place for us to be in an information economy. As we see, there are demagogues everywhere. I see them every day, frankly, online. They're like pirates. They attempt to steer people's attention so that they can make a short-term profit. And so it's within that we come to your question about if you are simultaneously a content producer, a content distributor, someone who is actually also consuming vast amounts of content, how thoughtful are you about those discrete processes, what you produce, what you distribute, and what you consume? That to me is I use a lot of library science in that context about just organizing kind of the menu of what you're encountering and then discerning your priorities about which things you do in which area. But it takes time and energy. It's slow and it's exhausting. Like just as someone who is a scholar and I have enormous resources at my disposal to help me do it, I still have to really narrow down to 3 to 5 areas of how I interact with the information multiverse and then attempt to construct what I put out, what I allow to cross my path, and then what do I actually take in and base my sense of what's true on. And I just know like my middle school, high school, college students can't do that. All I can do is practice with them in small bites how to start to move down that path. The most comparable thing that I've had the most success with is showing people how to decode commercials and figuring out like when people are selling you something or attempting to manipulate your feeling about something, a service or a product that's being shown to you. And I have students who write me back years later and be like, I'm so glad I took that class. I can't believe how people try to steer my perspective all the time. And I wish I could get that to the place that everybody is equipped with that by the time you leave second or third grade, that you're not inclined to just trust what you encounter in the media, but at the same time, you can be discerning enough to find the things that are reliable and begin to use those to find your way forward in the world. But we're not there yet. We are so far removed. I think of um, where we were in the 1940s and 1950s as television was in its infancy. And we made a choice about it being primarily a commercial tool, that we wanted massive amounts of advertisers selling us Ajax soap in order to underwrite the programs that we produce. And that's all just, the ancestor of the kinds of pharmaceutical ads that I see all over American media. We're trying to steer people to imagine problems that they have so that they will pay more money for a treatment that they may or may not need. And so, as we get more genetic science, that's going to get worse, and people don't understand biology, neuroscience, genetics, epigenetics. There's just so much information for us to sort through that it's difficult for people to start to screen down. And so what I'm trying to do is reinvent what we do as education from the time you're 2 or 3 years old. Like, we can't continue to use 19th century ideas in the 21st century. And that process, it's always about screening and prioritizing. And you have to kind of know yourself if you're going to then enter into that, is kind of how much do I want to give to this process about who I am and what my digital footprint is and how it connects to any other number of people. I haven't even gotten to the point about choosing community and starting to figure out who you're connected to and how does that influence what you're going to have access to and what you share to kind of create common meaning. All those things are possible, but they require real careful thought. And right now, the first step for me is not even at the federal level within the United States, but really internationally. How do we have an information regime that screens for the most truthful information without allowing state abuse to kind of manipulate and propagandize people? So I'm sympathetic to Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and these folks who don't trust government to oversee and regulate what they can produce and distribute. At the same time, I am more sympathetic to the masses of population, the 8 billion people you mentioned, who I don't trust them. I don't trust the information managers to choose in the interests of most of humanity. And that's the lesson that strikes me coming out of World War II, is that we had a series of medical protections that came in to protect people from medical and human rights abuse. We need a similar international regime to protect people from digital and information abuse. And it's not going to be a 1 or 2 year process. Like, I fully expect it's going to take us 25, 30, 50 years to generate those agreements. But that's the process we need to start right now.
I couldn't support media literacy, which I feel like we're already behind. And then there's a whole nother layer of AI literacy. And I know this is coming out right before the elections in the US. So this is a perfect example of not believing anything on the internet. And especially if you get emotional response, to take a beat and pause and really and vote.
Be a highly informed voter who understands both intellectually what you want to have access to, what kind of media world you want to be in, but also materially. Do you want more people to have success, or are you more comfortable with only a few people being more successful? There are two really different versions at the presidential level, and really at the level of the Congress and the Senate, and even in the state government. Some people want there to be more people who have middle class lifestyles. Others feel like more people should probably struggle and aren't equipped to really maintain a middle class or wealthy lifestyle. And so, whatever vision you choose, know which candidate represents you. And that's the vision where you should cast your ballot. Do you want prosperity for more or prosperity for fewer? And that fundamentally is a choice, not just in the US, but around the world.
So well said. Thank you. And I will include links to media and AI literacy resources in the accompanying dedicated blog post. So one thing that you mentioned, kind of casually, is as an Afrofuturist, but you're actually one of the founders of Afrofuturism, and I'd love for you to share what it is, because it's such a great way. Because you mentioned, the powers that be want to limit imagination, and there's so many things that we just accept as normalized, and that we're so stressed all the time and so many distractions with dings and notifications and texts that we live in this like stressed state. And I've said this in my presentation, Farewell Imagination Age, or Farewell Information Age, Welcome to the Imagination Age. Like when we're stressed and distracted, like we're not even calm enough to to think expansively, because like when you're stressed, you're in like the freeze, flight, or fight mode, and you can only do one thing, in that survival. And we've all been in such survival mode with our media landscape, not tigers and lions and bears and all those things. And it's hard because we've hyper normalized that this is somehow normal and accepted this. And yeah, I don't think a lot of us give us permission to dream bigger and dream differently. But Afrofuturism is a vehicle to do that. So I'd love for you to share more about Afrofuturism.
Yeah, this is an area that's dear to my heart. I know I couldn't have existed without the influences that are now referred to as Afrofuturism, but shaped my entire life. So, as a historian, I'm one of the few. I am probably the oldest. I'll say it like that. The oldest professional historian who has been studying and engaged with Afrofuturism. Um, Professional history for most of the 20th century asserted as a field that there was no African or African diaspora history. Just in the last 3 years, the largest professional association, the American Historical Association, has taken action to repair the damage it did to women historians, to Black historians, to historians of the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, and Africa by ignoring their work and not allowing it to be taught in undergraduate or graduate education. The flagship example of this is W.E.B. Du Bois. His work established what it was to do empirical historical research in the late 19th century, and he was not recognized as part of historical discourse and study until 30 years after his death in the early 1990s. And so the denial of Black history was one battle that people of the African diaspora had to fight and win. And in the midst of that, as that battle was being won in the years following the Brown versus Board decision, it was really literary scholars, Black literary figures, who began to challenge the idea of, is there a future for Black people? Because writers like Isaac Asimov focused on future studies, Robert Heinlein, the greats of science fiction. They couldn't imagine substantial roles for Black people in the future. The futures were filled with white people, and there was no one else besides that. And it's a profoundly kind of genocidal assumption to assume whatever post apocalyptic event happens, it just wipes out anybody who is not from Europe. And you look at things even in cinema like Mad Max, where you get this sense that everything is Australia, and it's primarily white Australia, no Aboriginal people. And so there's this extraordinary set of assumptions between 1955 and really the rise of Octavia Butler in the mid 1990s, to then interrogate, okay, well, humanity is not just from Europe. Where are the futures for all of the different kind of people who have existed in this world? And so that Black science fiction exploration was then named by Mark Derry Afrofuturism in a conversation with Columbia students, most notably Alondra Nelson. But that then still didn't become common language. Uh, Basically, a decade later, 2005, with Black Lives Matter, people started to say, well, we've got to imagine futures for people, or else we're kind of consigning them that their deaths and their marginalization is perpetual. And it was a decade after the emergence of Black Lives Matter that basically you started having large conferences of people coming together calling themselves Afrofuturists. And it was primarily artists. It was folks who were novelists, graphic artists, musicians. Hip hop has a huge role in Afrofuturism with artists like Andre 3000 or Busta Rhymes or Missy Elliott, that they're using different kinds of fashion and style, that they're showing different ways to be Black that are not constrained by the traditions of the 20th century. Sun Ra, as an experimental jazz musician, was a forerunner of a lot of that work. And so Afrofuturism is really at its root about imagining the futures of the people of the African diaspora. One of the great phrases that came out of this period is an Octavia Butler quote, is that there may be nothing new under the sun, but there are other suns. And so this notion that, yeah, maybe not on this planet there isn't going to be freedom, but we'll go somewhere and there'll be a more free society somewhere in the future for us that couldn't exist here. And so this then influenced the work of the journalist she wrote Caste, Isabel Wilkerson, whose first book was about the Great Migration, and the title is The Warmth of Other Suns. I should say that again, The Warmth of Other Suns. And so that frame of reference, after the Ferguson incidents with Mike Brown and then the community uprising, the protests that even stretched forward to George Floyd in 2020, was it's possible to build a world where law enforcement and criminal justice is not so deeply racialized. And so Afrofuturism gained an enormous endorsement at that point. But it was also Octavia Butler again with her, my favorite two books from her are Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which basically in the 1990s scripted out what happened with the Trump presidency and what happened with the COVID pandemic. And it was actually terrifying to go back and reread those novels and see how accurately she predicted the world we lived in 2020 and 2021. And so those kinds of just evolutions of human society have made it that Afrofuturism has become a driving international force for a different kind of human civilization. My colleague Ronaldo Anderson has built a global network of over 50,000 Afrofuturists, mostly in the Western Hemisphere, but also in Europe and in Africa. And we're going to be getting together in Amsterdam for a major event in early December, so about a little over a month from now. And that work of Afrofuturism is not just about people of the African diaspora. It's saying, how do we create freer human civilizations? And so, because I do it a lot with economics and creating less hierarchical economic systems, my work has morphed into what I call speculative design, which looks at different kinds of architecture and urbanization and moves us back towards the pre-modern, looking at a world that's based on mobility, especially in the context of climate change. And so how do we use less electricity? How do we produce less waste? How do we actually have a less hierarchical society that allows for all of us to live lives of dignity? And so my students study maroon communities in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean and Latin America, that we need to build places like this in order for all of us to have greater freedom, where it's not so extractive, it's not so capitalistic. Scholars at UC Berkeley have pioneered the field of Black geography. And this is all built around sustainable environmental design. And that's what Afrofuturism pushes us towards, is a freer world where all of us, we can't go through days hungry and unclothed and unsheltered and without care. It's a world where we're not just the money that we make and the status we achieve. We're fed by our relationships with each other.
That's such a great line about feeding each other. One thing that I really appreciate about Afrofuturism as well, that it's been kind of a theme on the show, and kind of to your point about Octavia Butler, is that there's so many narratives out there now that are more dystopian and the negative about what's to come. So it's like, what, that whole thing of where energy goes or attention goes, energy flows. It's like we're all putting our energy towards these dystopian outcomes versus a more utopian leaning, like the Afrofuturism, like Wakanda and Black Panther. I think that highlights a more positive vision of the future. Um, and one thing too, in just our discussions, I really appreciate how you like to challenge like assumptions that are embedded into society. And I think one that sits kind of in the middle of this is from this activist that I follow. I'm going to have to get her name, but in some of her Instagram videos, she has said that if we really want a different future, we have to not just keep climbing up the ladder because you're always going to be above or below someone, but break the ladder and have a more circular community connectedness and like linking instead of ranking, which Gloria Steinem's does all the time. But one thing that she said that really stuck to me as a white person is that we have such an imagination or a lack of imagination when it comes to real social justice, because we can't imagine that what we've done to others won't be done to us. And that just struck me so to the core. And when we talk about challenging assumptions, a world without conflict, where there can be different futures, I'd love to kind of hear your reaction to that and anything that you want to add about how we limit our imaginations.
Yeah, so there's a lot in what you're connecting and tapping into there, and I would say there are a body of colleagues of mine who do educational counseling. They train school counselors about creating healing environments for people who experience trauma, and how do you recover, how do you move towards a wholer, fuller version of ourselves, just emotionally, not even always physically. And so there's that kind of work that is just endless. There's thousands of resources to share there. But I also think about a story I teach about Martin Luther King, where he had gone into Alabama. He was doing a revival meeting, and a sheriff, a white Southern sheriff who favored segregation, went into the meeting with his revolver loaded and intended to catch King unawares and shoot him and kill him that night. And in the course of waiting at the back of the service, he heard Marian Anderson sing Amazing Grace. And Marian Anderson has one of these great voices on par with anyone we see today, the Mariah Careys, the Whitney Houstons. She is the legendary singer of the middle of the 20th century. And that sheriff, in hearing her sing that song, was so moved that he unloaded his gun and waited until King came near him and handed King the bullets and said, "My weapons have no power. I can't fight against the kind of beauty and the struggle for justice that you represent. It's like, you've touched my heart and I know I was wrong." I don't think we grapple enough with those kinds of stories about the power of art, the power of music, the power of faith to kind of transform how we relate to one another. And that's something that is beyond the idea of vibranium and Wakanda, although they make a gesture towards it in the films about, in T'Challa being upset that his cousin forces him to kill him, and he wants to give him some grace or try to heal him before he passes. The way that you see Shuri as Black Panther forgive Namor for killing her mother, urged by her mother from the beyond to say, no, this is not who we are. We are not people who kill out of vengeance. These are profound human lessons that Afrofuturism brings us to about how do we stop seeing ourselves as Black and white and Latino and Asian? How do we affirm our humanity first and foremost when we are in contact with each other? And so that does require breaking the ladder in the way that you described. And I think of Adrienne Marie Brown on Instagram is spectacular in the work that she does to heal and recognize our fullness as humans. Uh, Back to where we started with the questions of time and its fluidity and time as love. I think of Rashida Phillips as someone I've worked with for many years on that question. She has a new book coming out on the nature of time and how we must reinvent it. Um, that work in terms of time and not being about the next alarm and the next email we have to send and the urgency of every single moment to be productive. That if we reclaim time in the way that we joke about with some memes about the way Congress can operate, um, when we reclaim our time and we connect to each other and care for each other with our time, there's no limit to the amount of goodness, the amount of healing we can offer each other. And I know I just met a theologian that was at Stanford. His name is Bio Akomolafe. And he just did an extraordinary talk at Macalester about reinventing our sense of time as humanity and to not allow our time to be consumed with our commercial and our labor practices and reserving time for each other to actually live extraordinary lives together. Um, the movement is growing, and I'm very confident that we'll move to a day where the kinds of weight and pain that we've carried and inflicted on each other can actually end, and we'll have a more humane existence here.
Thank you. I I think just one of the takeaways is healing just needs to happen across the board and for all of our nervous systems to calm down so that we can even be more expansive. Um, there's so much that we could keep going, and I know that we're going to dive into a lot more of the concepts because we're really just scratching the surface with everything. But since you already kind of segued a little bit into time, uh, we could end here and then pick up this for our next conversation. But one thing that you shared in an earlier conversation is, the assumptions of where we're all at is like that time. There's is a scarcity mindset. There's never enough time. We have FOMO, all these things. But really, we can reframe that and challenge that notion of time as abundance. And I asked you, what's the difference, or what would be your answer to or opposite of time as money? So I'll let you answer that for the audience.
Yeah, so I love the question that as you posed it. It was really, like I said, it's something I teach a lot, but the moment that I got to share it with Rashida Phillips and the work that she's done with it in the years since then, it's really time is love. It's what we choose to give to each other. I actually think of one of my college roommates, a guy named Simon Tiffin. He and I went to Villanova together, and he was very harried, and I was very harried, frankly. Like we were always trying to do things and get things done. And he literally said to me, like, how do you make time, or why is there so much squeezed into the time that you have? And I was like, well, Simon, it's not a question of finding time. It's a question of making time for the things that you value. And he had never come across a phrase like that he could make the time for the things that were most important to him. And he and I are still really tight and talk with each other on a regular basis. And that is just a different orientation. And, I can't say that was me saying that in that moment. That was something beyond this world kind of speaking through me. But that whole piece, I think they tried to show it in one of the Star Trek films. I think it was Insurrection, where one of the aliens that Picard is trying to help is showing him that he can slow down time when he's with someone that he cares about, and those moments can feel like entire lifetimes that you pack into this time, that the subjective experience just goes on and on. And in that way, you can do extraordinary things because you're escaping from the way time is measured by all of our institutional authorities. That's what I mean with the abundance of time, is that within any given moment, we can stop. And I actually do this a lot with my classes where I'm watching time very intently, but I'm trying to cultivate for the students the fact that it seems like the time will never end. There's so much, it's passing quickly for them, but it also feels like they never wanted to end. And so that kind of effect, it shouldn't just be in schools. It shouldn't just be in the homes when we're coping with some of our kind of deepest emotional connections. There are ways we can choose to extend time or to abbreviate time based on where we're at. That again is it's teachable, but we don't teach it very often.
Well, that is such a good teaser for our next conversation. We can kick off with time. I know from our last conversation, I've just been more aware of my relationship to time. And I've actually paid for a course a couple of years ago of like how to get into flow state, but we've all
Yes.
experienced it.
Yes.
Like when time kind of disappears and we're in the zone, whether of athletes or business leaders or artists. So I find this very fascinating because we're being called to use our imaginations. And we need to give ourselves permission and the calm relaxedness to be able to think expansively too. So all of this works hand in hand as we're imagining our future
If I
or
add one
reimagining
little thing to
what's
add is
possible.
just this morning
Yeah,
I
of
watched the
course.
most recent episode on Disney Plus of Agatha All Along, which is this extraordinary piece of art that they've done. But the episode they just posted was about one of the women in the coven with the main characters experiencing time slippage, where she was moving in 1 second from hundreds of years ago to the present, to weeks ago, to moments and days ahead. And it ends with what looks like is her death, but it's actually the very beginning of her life. And so, like, there's just extraordinary exploration of how rich and textured and deep and unending our human experience is. And so, like, this conversation is happening all around us. When you see it on a Disney program, like it's just the consciousness is changing, and so there's a lot we can accomplish together.
Well, and then one of my favorite films that explores this in a different way, from a very fictional way, or I guess that's fictional too, but is Arrival, which was
Yes,
based
yes.
on a Ted Chiang novel, which I'd love to have him on the show if anyone knows Ted Chiang. And then Denis Villeneuve, who's like such an amazing filmmaker. But it's a show, it's like a show about aliens, but it's actually about the importance of language and connection and our relationship to time. And some review on YouTube I watched, uh, so these aren't my words, but it was like the way that Denny uses the language of film to reinforce our relationship to time is just it's a masterpiece of filmmaking.
No,
So
the mother
I
daughter
love it.
relationship in that film, I've watched that film hundreds of times just because I love the way it's crafted. And some of the most important people in my life pointed it out to me because they knew the kind of work I was doing. And yes, you are now gold star kind of in my life. We shared a moment talking about Arrival. I love it.
I recommend it. It's a very slow movie, especially compared to TikTok attention spans, but it's beautiful in every aspect. So I could geek out about it. Arrival all day with you.
Anytime, anytime.
Well, Walter, before I let you go, one question I ask all of my guests is if you want our listeners and viewers to remember one thing, what's that one thing that you want them to walk away with today?
Today, I posed a question online a couple weeks ago, and I would love it if viewers would share their opinions with me, particularly on social media or even just on their own streams that I might stumble across. Um, it's an impossible question. What is the best Wu-Tang Clan song ever produced?
I love it. I love it. Well, I'll try to add polls to our social content when we publish this interview and get the feedback. It is such a pleasure, and I know we're just scratching the surface. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your energy, your presence, and so much of your life's work and what you're passionate about. It really means the world to me. So thank you.
Honored to work with you anytime. Thank you.
Thank you for spending some time with us today. We're just getting started and would love your support. Subscribe to Creativity Squared on your preferred podcast platform and leave a review. It really helps. And I'd love to hear your feedback. What topics are you thinking about and want to dive into more? I invite you to visit creativitysquared.com to let me know. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter so you can easily stay on top of all the latest news at the intersection of AI and creativity. Because it's so important to support artists, 10% of all revenue Creativity Squared generates will go to ArtsWave, a nationally recognized nonprofit that supports over 100 arts organizations. Become a premium newsletter subscriber or leave a tip on the website to support this project and ArtsWave. And premium newsletter subscribers will receive NFTs of episode cover art and more extras to say thank you for helping bring my dream to life. And a big thank you to everyone who's offered their time, energy, and encouragement and support so far. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. This show is produced and made possible by the team at Play Audio Agency.
Just a dream.
Until next week, keep creating.